next presenter, which I don't have the light to read. Here we go. Dr. Ebony Glover, Trauma in the Female Brain from the Radow College of Humanities and Social Sciences. Ebony. All right. Do you remember your very first trauma? And what I mean is a super scary moment where you thought that maybe I might die. And I don't mean to be morbid, but the reality is most of you will experience some form of trauma in your lifetime. My very first trauma was the experience of nearly dying in the Atlantic Ocean when I was 10 years old. But obviously I survived because here I am holding a rat 15 years later. And I'm curiously pondering what would happen to the brain of this rat if I put it in that chamber and then applied electric shocks to its feet. Now, I know what you're thinking. What is wrong with this lady and why is she shocking rats? Well, I promise I'm not shocking rats for fun. I was shocking rats for science. For my dissertation research, I wanted to see if it was possible to create a trauma, to start a trauma, and then to erase the trauma in a rat brain. And if you think it's hard to erase trauma in a rat brain, which it really was, it's very hard to erase trauma in a human brain because traumatic memories get settled in a part of the brain called the amygdala, which is deep in the brain. And once it settles there, it really sticks. And if it's hard to erase a tiny little rat's memory of this crazy graduate student shocking them, can you imagine how hard it is to erase a complex human trauma? And you might wonder, well, why would you even want to erase human trauma? Well, imagine if your traumatic memory is that of witnessing your friend being blown to pieces right in front of you and seeing their guts being spread out around you. Now, that's the type of memory that will keep you up at night and stay around in your body for a very long time. And this is what happens with post-traumatic stress disorder, which, contrary to most people's beliefs, is actually more common in women than it is in men. In fact, women are 2 times more likely to develop PTSD after trauma. And women's symptoms of PTSD are much more severe than they are for men. Trauma for men and women are very different. Men tend to experience trauma related to combat trauma or even violence related to like threats with a weapon, whereas women are more likely to experience sexual trauma or intimate personal violence. And these traumas, have a social component as well as an environmental component, but even so, women still have a disproportionate risk, even when you factor in those components. And women have a harder time seeking treatment because women's lives, they carry a lot of things. They wear a lot of hats. And so women tend to struggle with treatment. But untreated PTSD is a major public health problem. And so I set out to try to understand this. So when I completed my dissertation, I stopped shocking rats and I started thinking about women. And I wanted to know what was different about the female brain compared to the male brain and trauma, why women were more vulnerable to trauma. Turns out, women have reproductive hormones that fluctuate dramatically across a woman's life cycle. And as you can see, 2 of the major female hormones dramatically decline over age. And during the monthly cycle, you can see a dramatic fluctuation of both estrogen and progesterone throughout that 28-day cycle. And interestingly, women have more fear and anxiety at the beginning of the cycle and at the end of the cycle when estrogen levels are super low. Now, here's a little side note. Did you know that estrogen comes from the word estrus, which is the ancient Greek word that means gadfly? And so Hera, the goddess of women and childbirth, sent this annoying gadfly to torment her husband's secret lover. And so now that gadfly is my monthly period. So thank you, Hera, for that. So I wanted to understand if estrogen played a role in women's, trauma experience, and if the level of estrogen was a factor. And so based on, previous research, I hypothesize that women with low estrogen levels and who experience trauma will be at higher risk than women with high estrogen levels. Also, a lot of women are using contraceptives. And so I wanted to see if the use of contraceptives, which is a synthetic, oftentimes a synthetic form of estrogen and progesterone, if that also factored into anxiety risk. And so in my lab, we measure fear in women, and we do this by using a human version of the scary rat shock chamber. And we measure fear by really measuring how big or how much someone startles to a loud noise, and also how much they sweat when they're nervous. And so we apply electrodes to the hands and also to the face to quantify this physiological defensive response in humans. And I train a lot of undergraduates in my lab, and they love doing this type of research. And so it turns out my key findings are that women with low estrogen have exaggerated fear responses compared to women with high estrogen, and that women who use hormonal contraceptives tend to have a heightened risk for developing anxiety after trauma. So what do we do with this information? Well, we could educate women and girls about the potential impact of their hormones on their mental health. And we could also warn women about the potential negative impact of contraceptive use on mental health risk and, and things like that. And so we can all do something to help close the gap between the health of men and women. First, we can end violence against women and sexual assault against women and girls. We can increase opportunities for women in science. And finally, we can fund more research like mine to keep moving. Thank you.
The amazing Ebony Glover.
Woo!